Hello, my name is Jon Trott. I was for 2 decades plus an editor, senior editor, and editor-in-chief finally toward the end of Cornerstone Magazine, the publication of Jesus People USA, um, as well as a co-author of various lyrics on Res Band albums over the years. Also, Res Band was a band also associated with Jesus People USA. But the single thing that I view personally as my quote unquote ministry or calling, if you will, as a Christian, is membership in this strange group called Jesus People USA. So, what the heck is it? What does it mean to be a communitarian and a Christian? And that is maybe what I'm going to try to explore here as I record this on my Samsung Note 9 phone. High tech. In a nutshell, Jesus People USA is a group that came out of the Jesus movement. Not the historic Jesus movement of the first century directly, but rather the Jesus movement of the 20th century in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was a movement among the counterculture hippies and among some of the church kids, frankly, who were looking at the counterculture hippies and wishing they could do that. And basically, some of the countercultural accents, such as long hair, rock music, social protest folk music, the dress that the hippies had, the cultural emphasis, the consciousness that they had, more importantly, a consciousness that was somewhat aware of race as something that their parents had blown big time and they were going to try to correct. They were children aware of the civil rights movement's outcome, the assassination in 1968 of Martin Luther King. Those things were all there in the background as this new movement of Christian faith with evangelical and charismatic aspects to it, swept through the hippie counterculture. And out of that came these different communal groups, Jesus People USA being one of them. There's a long history of it, which I won't probably go into. It came from a group called Jesus People Milwaukee, which fragmented up into different ministries, one of which my wife Caroline Trott was in overseas, known as the Jesus People Family, who traveled in Europe and did a rock opera called Lonesome Stone. But anyway, back to the US and back to Jesus People USA's story, which began in 1971. And in 1971, this bus of hippies, there were about 30 people in the group, traveled across the country, went up through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan down into the Florida area, Gainesville, Florida area, and stayed there for a few months, came back up north. That's where the USA came from. It has no political significance. It's a location, just as you had Jesus People Milwaukee, Jesus People Seattle, Jesus People Spokane, all these groups not really connected in any official way. Jesus People USA took that name simply because they were traveling. They were in fact, that was part of the name originally. It was Jesus People USA Traveling Evangelistic Ministry. What the heck was the rest of the name? I don't even remember. Anyway, the point being that they ended up in Chicago, and from there, that's where the story, in a sense, really begins, in that the ministry began to take on a semblance of permanence. A number of these communal groups simply failed. And that was par for the whole communal experience of the 1960s. 99% of these groups did not last, whether they were Christian or non-Christian in emphasis. The communal movement simply did not last, and there were a number of reasons for that, in my opinion. The biggest one being that living communally is very hard. You're basically creating a sort of family. There are responsibilities to be taken on. There are issues of authority. Who's got the final word, or is there a final word? Is the communal group going to be run as an oligarchy, or is it going to be run as a free-for-all, where only the responsible folks take on the responsibility and everybody else does what they please, leading to many, many hurt feelings? Anyway, all those things make communal life more interesting and more difficult. Add God into the mix and you think that would solve everything. I think perhaps it complicates things, because now you have people beginning to talk about, well, God told me this is how we're supposed to do things, and you have other people saying, well, he told me the opposite, and so on and so forth. So it's all a crash course in human relationships. It's a crash course in theology. It's a crash course in ways to potentially abuse one another rather than enhancing one another's lives. It's a crash course in either being loving or being cruel. And in most of us, unfortunately, some of both of those things end up emerging in community, because it is a crucible for faith experience. Now, Jesus People USA, I came into the story in 77. And in this year of Trump, I should say these 4 years of Trump, and we're hoping there's not going to be 4 more years, and there I just lost half my audience. It's important to me to perhaps particularly focus on the political dimensions of why Jesus People USA did not go the route that many of our evangelical sisters and brothers went, particularly white brothers. Part of that could be ascribed to living in the inner city, perhaps, if you want to be sociological about it. I could just give God all the credit, or even try to give us all the credit, which would be absolutely ludicrous. But instead, I'll kind of be semi-sociological and suggest that living in the inner city gave us a different vision. We came in and did the typical Jesus People thing, which across the country, everybody would go out and preach the gospel. You evangelized. You wanted to bring people into a relationship, a living relationship with Jesus Christ. But what we soon found out was that by doing that, we began to run into things like, for instance, a single mother who is pregnant and has nowhere to go. And we took her in, and she ended up staying with us and having her child and eventually marrying, and so on and so forth. We encountered homeless people. We encountered people who were drug addicts. And we suddenly realized that our responsibilities here, loving one's neighbor, of course, had to do with, in part, introducing them to God, introducing them to the beloved Jesus that we were in love with. But it also meant embodying what that love was about, which was caring for our neighbor, listening to our neighbor, finding out what their burdens were. And over time, these things are lessons that are taught slowly and are very painful. Learning to listen to our neighbor and find out what their world is, what their needs are. And then at times, whether or not they were even Christians, being taught by our neighbor, learning from our neighbor. learning from an atheist lawyer who's down the street and deals with prisoners, learning from Muslims who we meet through a school building that our kids were renting. We learned from our neighbors. We learned to love our neighbors in deeper ways. And all of that made it very interesting as Christians living in a commune to see what living in a commune means. Living in what to us was less, we don't use the word commune as much as I use it. I use it a lot because it's one of the particularly valuable things about living at Jesus People USA for me personally. Many of my friends never mention the word. They're way more invested in the word ministry, which probably is a more biblical idea even than the concept of a commune. That is, they are interested in outreach to our neighbors. But me, going back to the commune concept for a second, one of the things that really is one of the stress points, and I mean it in a positive way, but it's a painful thing, but it's a positive thing, is there are a number of stressors it's not either or, it's both and all the time, and it drives you nuts because you want it to be either or so that you can draw firm, dark lines and grid everything out and lock everything down. But that's what living in community trains you not to do if you're listening to your neighbor and even listening to your pal down the hall, or listening to your wife for that matter. And that is that my vision of Jesus People USA is mine. It isn't the whole community's. My understanding of loving my neighbor is mine, not the whole community's. And the community's understanding of loving its neighbor is still limited, still changing, still growing, hopefully growing. We've had to discard some things that were accents in our past. We've had to turn up the volume and other things. We've had to increasingly self-consciously move away from white evangelicalism as is commonly conceptualized in America. For instance, here, I'll lose some more people here, but with Black Lives Matter, we very intensely embrace Black Lives Matter. We don't get hung up on trying to parse out what the so-called leaders of Black Lives Matter, which I'm not really sure, frankly, that there are this little thin core of leaders. There's just Black Lives Matter, which is a gigantic movement, kind of like the Jesus movement was. It's spread out over the entire country. Black Lives Matter is what each individual brings to it to be. And that individual's contribution to the whole enlarges the movement, hopefully, makes the movement stronger, makes the movement deeper. And that is what we, though very cautiously, because most of us are white, so we're not going to try to be leader dogs in Black Lives Matter. We are going to try very consciously to be followers of those who are most who are most directly affected by the issues that Black Lives Matter is facing, namely the murder of mostly young black men, but young black women as well, and other persons of color, Hispanics and so on, Latinx, and indigenous people, and so anyway, we are a community of individuals, and that's the tension point that I think is our creative engine, that none of us own the definitions. None of us get to say for everyone else what community is. And if you think that sounds like I'm being humble and spiritual, think again, because there are many days when I would dearly like to tell everyone else here what to do. But as most communitarians are in actuality, this is something that flies against the common wisdom, the conventional wisdom. Most communitarians are more rebelliously individualistic than your run-of-the-mill American. And the reason for that is that to be a communalist in America is in essence a decision to rebel against the very core value of what makes an American, which is this sort of idea of the rugged individual who is self-contained, self-motivated, the John Wayne character in the movie. At least in our experience, or at least I should say, and here we are, I'm limiting myself, at least in my experience, living in community has been a long, relentless lesson in allowing my individuality to be interrupted by other people's individuality, to allow myself to be shaped, not crushed, not eliminated, not zeroed, not erased, but to be severely challenged and confronted by other person's individuality and other person's vision of what this life we share together means. So I share all that, and it's a rather run-on, just sort of open, just some thoughts with all sorts of tributaries I'm not going to go down right now. In light of what we're facing right now in the country, which is an election that features a middle-of-the-road Blair liberal over against a man who is someone who has helped preside over 190,000 plus deaths via COVID, who is invested in mammon, if I can use the biblical term for materialism, wealth, who is invested in a mythos of an America that never existed. There never was a Christian America. If there was a Christian America, let me put it bluntly, I would not be a Christian if I believed there was a Christian America. Because if there was a Christian America, that's the America that owned people, that sold people, human beings, that raped people just to make more slaves. And that was fine. I don't invest in that vision. I don't believe it was ever a reality historically. I believe the slavery was a reality. I believe the rapes were a reality. I believe out-and-out murder, 100 years of lynching, to quote the title of one book, those were realities historically. There has never been a Christian America, and there never will be. There are only Christians in America, and some of those Christians are the worst advertisement ever for Christianity or Christ. I'm not going to go into whether I think they are Christians or not. That's a dodge. That's God's business. Beyond my pay grade, as Barack Obama once said, and I agree. Anyway, the punchline is, I hope that all of you, whether you are interested in communitarian lifestyles or not, will consider the fact that you live in a community as an important fact, the community of America. This is a community of communities. Here we all are together. We all have very different ideas about things, about both our membership in said community and our responsibilities in said community. But I will say that if you don't understand Black Lives Matter, if you don't understand the nature of the fascism that faces us right now and is threatening, frankly, to steal the heart of American Christianity, take a lesson from this old communitarian. Love God, love Jesus, who was not white, who is not white. There never was a white God or a white Jesus. Because whiteness itself is from the pit. It's a lie. My skin tone is not white, but there is whiteness in me. We created this. We white folks, Christian and non-Christian, but especially Christian. I have to say the history of the country is that theologians participated in the construction of whiteness. And it was for economic reasons. It was for devilish reasons, if I can invoke the name of that minor character. We have to look at ourselves and we have to decide whether or not we are going to embody the values of the God-man who thought equality of God with God was not to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a man and being born into a manger and walking through this life, being persecuted and finally ending up crucified on a cross by both religious and secular authorities in collusion, the powers of the world. Either we side with him or we side, even while using his name, side with his opponent. And yes, I do believe in the devil. I believe that he exists. And I believe this is a time when it is time for human beings to look at their neighbor and really deeply consider what loving your neighbor means. Please do vote. And that's all this communitarian has to say today. Bye.